Hello, everybody. Welcome to the SIG architecture meeting of 9 February 2023. I'm your host, Kleinans, and this meeting is being recorded to the cloud for everybody to view it later. And keep in mind, we adhere to the CNCF code of conduct while being in this meeting, which means be excellent to each other. All right, so let me see if I can pop out the agenda here and share with me.
Brian, if you want, I can share my screen and do note taking.
Yes, I can share your screen. It's giving me a hot on bandwidth here. So
I can't share my screen. If, where did we? Jordan, can you grant me perms?
Multiple. You should be. I changed it.
There. Thank you very much. That did the trick. I'm going to share one.
All right, and first item up, do we have Arvin in the meeting?
Yeah,
Arvin,
I'm here.
You can go first.
Hey, folks. My name is Arvin. I work at Red Hat, and I'm here to talk about this node log query feature. This is a feature. So to give you some history behind this, this is a feature that basically lets you look at node logs of services that are running on nodes using kubectl. The KEP was opened a couple of years ago and was accepted. And I've been working through the implementation for the last couple of years. This is a feature that was first present in OpenShift, was added by Clayton. And when I started working with SIG Windows, the biggest problem SIG Windows, or what we have in the Windows world, is that a Windows node will come up, it'll come up as ready, and then a customer will try to bring up a Windows pod and it'll fail. And no idea why it failed by looking at the pod, status. And typically what happens at that point is you ask the user to give us the kubelet logs, the runtime logs, and there's always a lot of back and forth about how the user can go about getting it. And so this, when I mentioned to SIG Windows that, hey, this is the way we do this in OpenShift, there was a big push to upstream it. So I decided, okay, I'm going to upstream this feature. So we have had a lot of back and forth in the last couple of years, and it finally reached. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I had some noise here. I'll mute.
Okay. So we had a lot of back and forth, and I think the question which finally Jordan asked in the last round of reviews in the implementation PR is whether we should be expanding kubelet ability to expose the whole host logs. The expectation, I feel, is in some sense what we're trying to figure out is the cluster admin equivalent to a node admin in some sense? And then what is the way to move forward with this project, right? Do we either say, okay, this is something we don't want to add as a feature that's disabled by default and needs to be enabled, or is that okay to do? So I think that's what we want to discuss here. Dims suggested that we bring this up at a SIG Arch call and talk it through. So that's what I'm doing at this point.
Yeah, I first want to apologize for bringing this up at this point. Mostly, I was trying to make sense of conversations going on in two different parts of the project. One part where security folks are saying like, oh, this defaults to exposing host logs. We shouldn't do that. We should stop exposing people's host stuff and recommend they not enable this. So let's default this off and recommend against it in hardened guides. And then reviewing this implementation PR where we're saying, oh, more host access. And I'm just trying to make sense of like how we can be coherent as a project. Anyway, Tim.
Thanks for bringing this today. I saw it on the agenda and I thought it would come. And I know that I had a lot to say in the early stages of the review of this. I feel a little bit like that Jeff Goldblum line. We spend a lot of time thinking about whether we could, not whether we should. I think the question of how much host access we should expose is a really apt question. And when you put the question, is a cluster admin necessarily a node admin? My alarms immediately went off. Like, I don't think that is a safe assumption. And so I think that's a really good question. So I just wanted to say, I agree with the premise of the question.
So I can't find how to raise my hand, but we talked this is Derek. We talked about this in SIG node as well. And I guess how I looked at this is that there's no actual elevation of privilege here. It is just convenience. And if we had a project posture that said cluster admin is not a node admin, then we have a whole host of things that contradict that today. So to me, when we talked about this in SIG node, it was like, well, yeah, you could deploy a privilege pod and read anything on that node today. I mean, this is how CNIs often deploy. This is how existing log forwarders often deploy. And the part that struck me as maybe unique in the Windows situation was that if you couldn't deploy your log forwarder, having something to fall back to wasn't the worst, possible idea. So I'm hard pressed to ask, or I'm hard pressed to see how a cluster admin today is not a node admin. And I kind of look at this more as how much additional surface space do you want to have the kubelet, give ease of use around or not. But I think it'd be inaccurate to say it's a privilege distinction.
At putting on my job hat, there are implementations of clusters where users don't have access to nodes, and even cluster owners don't get to SSH into nodes. And I don't know if there are implementation details that are hidden on those nodes, would be dangerous for a user to see. I don't suspect so, but I don't think it's safe to assume that the one thing is necessarily the other thing.
Yeah, so for Tim on that point, I agree there are users that you could be root on cluster and then they don't actually give out to their end users, that cluster admin user role.
Even to their cluster admins, I'll pick on GKE Autopilot, which you can't SSH to those machines. They're not yours. They're managed machines.
Yeah, okay, I understand that. Which to me meant when evaluating this feature, and to be clear, like even wearing my OpenShift hat, right, there are plenty of users who disable the ability to do exec, attach, or logs generally. And I'm aware of security conscious customers of ours that do that. Typically that's in a hardened production environment in those environments. Whereas this just really felt like, how do we get users past the getting started inertia challenges of even, in this case, as my understanding, Arvin, tell me if I'm wrong, just being successful with a Windows node. So from that spirit, Tim, like I thought if the feature was disableable, the concerns you raise would be fine. I think the nuance, which I appreciate, Jordan, you raised, which was if you can disable it, it's not going to be a part of conformance. So then why have the upstream API generally? I think that's totally fair. My only perspective here is I think if we say cluster admin is not root on every worker node in the cluster, that's not a fair way to evaluate this in my feature, in my view, because that pretty much is true today, unless you do a lot of additional security hardening. And even then, I don't know how you fully stop cluster admin from deploying privileged pods on nodes.
Yeah, like the argument about convenience. I just because you could run a privileged pod and then do host mounts and like do I guess anything like that. That doesn't seem like a good reason to like build in sort of arbitrary things to the kubelet. Like if, but that would be a reasonable argument for like we could make the kubelet install systemd units or install Windows services or kind of do any other node admin-y type of thing that requires high levels of privilege.
Yeah, so I mean, just to be fair, like I view the kubelet as the node manager, and the kubelet does actually modify systemd units just in the normal operation of the node. Even at startup, the kubelet will reparent where systemd units are running in specific configurations. My only qualm in this discussion is not if the feature goes forward or not. I think it's perfectly okay to say no, it doesn't go forward, but I don't want us to establish a policy that says it shouldn't go forward because it's a privilege escalation. I think that would be inaccurate and not set helpful precedent. If it's we just don't think that this should be included, or because we don't think it beyond the preponderance of clusters, it's not in conformance. There are other avenues that people could choose to deploy an agent in their node prep to surface these logs too. I just, from my perspective, I want to make sure that we don't give the wrong rationale for why we do.
Yeah, I agree. Like I don't think it's an escalation issue. I think it's a scoping issue. Like you could deploy a pod to do this already in most clusters, not some locked down ones. But the question is this level of access, does that make sense to build into the kubelet's functionality? There was a comment I had later where, like the kubelet's already exposing host logs. So exposing host logs coming from more places is not worse. I just am trying to, like I said, figure out how we can be coherent as a project. If we're saying we don't recommend you turn on these things and expose these things, it feels weird to at the same time expand them. I don't know.
Mo, you want to go next?
I think I was called on.
Yes, Mo.
Yep, I got you. So I guess I was going to ask. So I don't have a good answer to have a Windows node and it just can't run pods at all. Like I don't really understand how a system shows up as ready, but it can't do the one thing it's designed to do. But I'll just ignore that because I don't understand anything about Windows nodes. To me, the won't be enabled by default, won't be part of conformance. Plus, you could do this with other means, sort of sounds like an add-on, right? Like something that you kubectl apply into your environment should you want to, right? So like I could imagine this entire feature being built with like a kubectl plugin, a daemon set, and an aggregated API server. Like if you wanted exactly the semantics that are basically defined in the.
Except it doesn't help you if it's not running pods, which was one of the main reasons that was cited.
No, I understand that. I'm more trying to understand, is that a thing that we are responsible for helping you with? Like if you have a thing called a kubelet, it exists to run pods. If it doesn't run pods, it shouldn't report ready. But I don't know. Tim, you want to go?
All right, Tim.
Yeah, I agree with the scoping issue. Is this Kubernetes' problem, or is this the node's problem to expose an API here? The one thing that makes me sort of lean a little bit towards, yeah, we could probably tolerate this if it's disableable, is convenience. We already provide a conduit from a user's command line, kubectl, all the way up through whatever mechanism they need to get into their cluster all the way back down to the nodes with some amount of auth-n and auth-z built in. That's pretty convenient. It's also a bad precedent for adding all sorts of random crap into kubelet. But it's worth considering, I think.
Aravind, you're next.
I'm wondering if there's a compromise here. Is the problem that you can look at all logs and the logs of all services? What if we had, I don't know, a kubelet configuration that said you can look at the kubelet logs, I don't know, the runtime logs, and list out the list of services that is allowed, and the list of log files that are allowed, for example? Would that be a compromise?
That seems like it would be more coherent with what we do for other things. So like giving you a way to get pod logs through Kubernetes is sensible. Giving you a way to get the logs for the API server through Kubernetes seems sensible. If this was letting you see the logs for the kubelet and the runtime, maybe things that are sort of within Kubernetes scope and related to the Kubernetes component, that seems a lot better to me at first glance than like any log of anything on the host. I don't know.
Okay, Mark, you can go next.
So yeah, I can add a couple comments. First, a little bit of history, and I think like maybe to answer the question, like why can't Windows nodes that are ready run Windows pods? One of the big motivations for this feature also was when pretty early when we were shifting from Docker to Containerd on Windows, there were a lot of issues in the Containerd implementation, and we would see like a node would be able to run pods fine, and then all of a sudden it would stop. And we've been almost all of those issues that we're aware of have been kind of fixed. Things are a lot more mature now. I think that this KEP was originally proposed in like 120, so we've had a number of releases to, harden things too. But with Windows, a lot of like all of the components are like really call into Windows APIs, and the way to get access to those logs are through the Windows eventing like system, which is what we do here too. So it's very hard to say like, oh, I want to be able to diagnose an issue with starting a container and without often having to look into these Windows logs. And unfortunately, like it's really hard to figure out which Windows logs you need up front. They go all over the place. So there's a lot of like tracking through just the various different Windows components, which all log to different places. And especially it's like we have the ability to run Windows pods as like an Active Directory identity. It's like if you do that, you need to debug and look at a completely different set of Windows logs in order to see why your potential Active Directory logon is failing too. So that was part of the reason why it was determined just let's let them view any of the system logs that they need. It's very hard to narrow down exactly what logs you could need to diagnose some of these issues where your containers just stop starting.
At what point, this sort of to answer both your question or your point, Mark and Arvind, at what point do we say this isn't Kubernetes' problem? This is Windows' problem. Windows should have a good remote log viewing experience, or whoever prepared your Windows nodes should have put an agent on there that lets you access those random nodes all over the place. That's not a Kubernetes problem. That's a somebody else problem, an ecosystem problem. Like, where's the line for that?
That's a good question. We've seen, and like in the early days, I think we're kind of narrowing down on and really hoping to have like kube80 MBUs to bootstrap the nodes. But in the early days, there were so many different ways to, bootstrap your Windows nodes. And I think this even came up in some issues with command line arguments to like kube proxy, that you were involved in some of those discussions, that when we found that when we left things up to the ecosystem, instead of kind of condensing on one or two ways best practices, it's like everybody just did their own thing. So that was another kind of motivation to try and just put this into the kubelet. But I could definitely, yeah, that's a good question of where's the line.
It sounds like in general, if we were to provide some best practices and approaches for the community to consolidate on for setting up nodes, I know we've a lot of people, we've left it up to the ecosystem and everyone's kind of doing their own thing. Is there a way that the Kubernetes project can have a harder recommendation for some decent defaults, not inside the Kubernetes code base, but in the Kubernetes Windows node processes, so that there's a more consolidation for the way in which we do Kubernetes together on Windows is solidified, so that all of these many approaches and doing things, that there's not a best way, there's the Kubernetes suggested way.
I mean, like how many steps do we want to add to have it so that your node is bootstrapped in the Kubernetes best way? It's like, I think at least from Windows, we've been trying to have it be as simple as, you know, install your container runtime, which is container D these days, and then get the normal like the processes that need to run on the node running, get kubelet, kubeproxy, your CNI configured, and then there you go. It's like, do we want to make this more complicated for people or easier, since this is like a quality of life improvement?
I mean, obviously we want to make things easier for people, but we also can't take the responsibility for everything under the sun, right? Just
Yeah,
we're talking a lot
makes
about
sense.
Windows, but I don't think it's just Windows. Like Windows is more acute than Linux in this regard, but I don't think the problem is actually fundamentally different. But to take Linux as an example, to prepare a node, you pick a Linux distribution, and the Linux distribution has config and options and installs. And did you choose to install SSH or not install SSH? Like, why would remote log viewer D not be just another thing you choose to install on your Linux machine when you're setting it up? And again, I'll go back to my own point about the convenience, like having the conduit all the way from kubectl to get there is, you know, it is convenient. I just want to make sure we don't sign ourselves up for becoming, Derek's gonna love me on this one, becoming systemd, where we build every damn thing into the one agent because it's just easier that way.
Yeah, I would also ask if this is primarily focused at like bootstrap bring up time, or if this is an ongoing like day 2 operations kind of thing. Because if it's bootstrap time, that seems like it could be way more reasonable for the thing that is configuring the kubelet and running the kubelet. Like it's clearly doing things on the kubelet. If part of that process was a smoke test of, can I run a container? Like, does the thing I just set up with the kubelet and containerd and CNI and whatever else, is it actually functional? Like a smoke test at the end that says, did I run a container? And if I didn't, gather all the logs from these 3 things, whether it's Windows events or systemd, like whatever the setup is doing, and ship them off, or say like, I failed here. Blah. Like at bootstrap time, that's a more reasonable thing to do. If this is day 2 operations focused, that gets harder because you may not have persistent presence.
Arvind?
Yeah, I just want to answer Jordan's question. Yeah, this is not just during Bootstrap. We have issues like, hey, my node has been running for a week and now I'm not able to bring up containers. At which point we again ask them for kubelet logs, runtime logs. So it does happen, like not just during Bootstrap on the Windows side.
Arvind, was this discussion helpful? Does it help you to move it forward?
I still don't have clarity whether I should go back and, you know, add more code and do the things that Jordan was asking me to do, or is this still a no? No, we don't want to add this feature. I'm sorry, guys. I'm sorry, folks. I know I'm putting people on the spot, but it's been 2 years, so we need some, like, either we do this or we don't, sort of thing, right? I don't know if everybody agrees, but that's where I'm coming from at this point.
Yeah, so to echo that, like I'm sympathetic to Arvin getting some closure here. I don't think I'm sympathetic to users who want to make it easier to debug systems. I would be fine, but honestly, I'm fine if this was a SIG Windows subproject and it was like, here's a practice and a plugin to do this type of action that Mo had described earlier. Like, I think that's a perfectly fine outcome. I know, Tim, as I noted there, I have no issue with systemd. I think systemd is just fine, but I'm not sitting here saying, hey, the kubelet should take on even more and more stuff either. I just
To be clear, neither am I. I'm not saying I don't have a strong feeling either way. I actually really understand this use case, and I don't want to downplay the convenience or importance of having this very fundamental thing be available. I just want to make sure we don't sign up for more than we think we are.
From my perspective, like I said, what this is doing is not worse than what the kubelet is already doing in terms of exposing var log, sort of philosophically at least. If this sort of stays at that level of exposure, yeah, I think it was a mistake to default that on. If this stays at the same level of exposure where it's just in the kubelet API, we don't add special API surface for it in kube API server, and it defaults off, then I have a hard time saying that this is worse than what we already have today.
I agree with that.
The kube control side, like making the client experience nicer, could be done with a kube control plugin that's like, handles fiddling with the proxy environments and like turns flags into parameters. Like maybe that's a way forward where we don't sort of commit to making this a first class thing, but it's there as an affordance for platforms that want to expose it.
I think there's an interesting idea in what you just touched on. Like, should we make a more generalized conduit from kubectl down to an individual node that is configurable on both ends, a plugin on the kubectl side and a configuration or route or something established on the kubelet side, so that this becomes one instance of a general model? That's a lot of work, but it's an interesting idea. Like a port forward in SSH.
The only other last thought here, just to share, is that there had been discussion in the past. I don't know how much people on the call maybe or whatever remember, but typically today when you configure a kubelet, you assign some resources that are reserved to the node, and then you have resources that are exposed for scheduling regular workload pods. There's been a number of requests in SIG node to allow pods to go under the system reservation bucket, separate from the normal allocatable bucket. And typically it's around use cases around node preparation of ecosystem, like things like, oh, I want to run my GPU driver under system reserved and not with the rest of the workload. So I could see like a trend that could go either way on this. Like we have more and more high privileged components that are wanting to deploy as pods on nodes to do drivery like things. But in that spirit, treating this like one of those plugins as well is fine to me. I guess, Arvin, what's your take on this? Like, would you want to split this out as a separate plugin and then make it available just as a SIG Windows project? Would that be satisfactory to you?
That is definitely one route we've been, Mark, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that we've been sort of bouncing back and forth within SIG Windows itself. We still have to figure out a way to get this all to work without having to deploy like, a pod on the node, because that sort of defeats the purpose. that's where I would be. That's my stance on if we had to do this, as a separate SIG Windows project. That's Windows specific, and we don't have any counterpart on the Linux side for this. And of course, Derek, we would have to figure something out for OpenShift.
Yeah, and I guess, yeah, ignoring individual product concerns. The only other thought on this I had is today the set of API resources that are servable by the kubelet is fixed. There have been other requests to make the set of things that could be served from the kubelet endpoint extendable. I guess one example in my head that we could have pursued this way is like the pod resources API that tells you things that have been scheduled by the kubelet on that node, like maybe that could have been done out of a tree or that type of thing. But maybe my question to Jordan and Tim would be if folks wanted to allow a plugin system to the kubelet to serve different endpoints from that kubelet, would we reject that in the SIG or from an architecture perspective, or is that a palatable path forward? We've got a number of requests from random folks on wanting to extend random parts of either the kubelet admission chain or the kubelet serving path. And we've never really had a discussion as a broader community if that's a good or a bad idea. But that would be the type of thing, like if Arvin, your point was, well, we'd still have to figure out how to get the wiring in place. I could see a counter argument coming forward to say, hey, let the kubelet have an extension mechanism that says for this path, this resource answers the question.
Yeah, I don't have any philosophical objection to that. And that's sort of what I was getting. That's what I took out of what Jordan had said, whether he meant it or not. I don't know the details of it, but you being the closest of all of us to kubelet, if you don't think it's off the bat crazy, then I'm willing to look at it.
To me, it's just a way of making us not have to answer every question, right? But we haven't given it deep thought. Honestly, I think as a community, if we could do more to get energy to focus on cleaning up the kubelet serving path, which I think technically we still treat internally in the kubelet as like not quite GA. That was just one thought, is could we kickstart a project to explore the space and maybe get some energy in that space?
Yeah, if we keep this scoped under the kubelet proxy, like the pipe that goes from the API server to the kubelet is kubelet proxy. This is where this started, and I take responsibility for being the one that said, like, this is inconsistent. Let's try to do a log sub resource. So I'm sorry. If we say we have a pipe from kube control through the API server to the kubelet through proxy, and platforms that don't give node access also don't give node proxy access. They just say you can't use that. The node is our responsibility. Kubelet endpoints are not well documented. They're not structured the same way the API server endpoints are. There's been talk in the past of making that consistent or making that better defined or putting guarantees around that. If dropping more endpoints under there so that kube control plugins could use the pipe that already exists from kube control through the API server to the node on platforms that allow it. That doesn't seem bad as long as it doesn't, like, if we're happy with the user experience where like different platforms might do things different ways. And so if you're trying to debug OpenShift, you might have to run the OpenShift node collector kube control plugin to hit the endpoints that are only registered in OpenShift. Like, that doesn't seem.
Yeah, I just want to. I have no concern in this discussion about OpenShift or a Red Hat product. Like, I don't want Arvin or myself coming here presenting. As
No. I mean, sorry, I didn't mean to pick on OpenShift. Same thing for like any other GKE or any other platform. Like, if they have specific log collectors with specific capabilities registered in nodes, and to debug a node on that platform, you have to know what you're looking for. That seems plausible. Yeah, I actually have to switch to mobile, so I have to drop. But if we keep this contained to the kubelet for now, I think the scope is a lot smaller and a lot easier to reason about and rationalize with like a future direction of node serving extension type things.
Agree. My primary concern is that it's something that providers can disable if they need to, and that we don't show too much of the details, that we could choose to implement it in some way like this more generic plugin.
And actually, I think enabling the existing host serving by default was a mistake. So I would make this default off, and providers can enable it if they want to expose that level.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is I need an option to this should default to off, option to enable it, and then I don't use the Cube API server route and go back to using the proxy. Is that what you're saying, Jordan?
I think so. I think enshrining this in a first-class API is probably not correct. So I'm sorry.
But
for asking about
I would
this.
still need a API, right, for this?
On the kubelet. On the kubelet.
Not in the, it shouldn't be a V1 code API. Is that what you're saying?
It would
It
be
would
like
be
how,
accessed under the node proxy.
yeah,
So
the same way
only
you could
people
get
who
node
get
metrics.
Proxy.
I see. So remove the V1 code API is what you're saying.
Yeah. And yeah, Jago asked about conformance. Nothing under the kubelet API surface is in conformance.
I see.
So yeah, everything under the kubelet API service is explicitly disclaimed from conformance.
Okay. All right. I can go back and reject this PR to not make it an API and just try and directly, as in go back to, I think, revision number, I don't know, few revisions back when this was not an API or something like that, and try and make it work that way.
Okay.
All right. I can take a look at that.
Thank you very much. Thanks for all the input and discussion. Arvind, is it okay if we step off the topic?
Yeah, thank you, folks, and thank you, Tim. Thank you, Jordan, for all the time you spent helping me out with this. I'm going to bother you more. Sorry about that too.
Thank you for being responsive and flexible and not hating on us.
We'll never do that.
All right, Stephen, I'm going to give the next topic over to you. Automated cherry picking, where they want to demote the client API, IP endpoints.
There's been a request for some of two conformance jobs to be backported to 1.24 and 1.25. The PR just needs to be merged, but the problem is that the automation process for the conformance bot takes its input from Sonobuoy. So the problem is Sonobuoy needs to be doing its update and publishing the logs, the list of tests, and then that needs to be then used by the end users. So the problem is there's nothing. Can we just open up that particular? Yeah, at the very bottom. I'm not sure personally about this cutoff date of February 10th, but the problem is that it's just not a fast fix, and there needs to be a better way of coordinating with the Sonobuoy team to be able to understand the publishing process better. And I've published, put a comment in the Sonobuoy Kubernetes channel, and I haven't had any feedback as of yesterday.
Quick note on the conformance process. The submissions to CNCF/CATES conformance require that all submissions are run, submit their logs. Most of the time, those logs are submitted from the tool called Sonobuoy, and the release for where the tests come from are from the 0.0 release. And so we don't use later tags because conformance is not meant to change. And when we're backporting stuff like this, we need to find a mechanism for when stuff is cherry picked and put into a new release. How do we change the definition of conformance for that back release? Because now it's changed since the release. Is that accurate?
I've actually found if you go to this, can you bring up the Slack for messages for Sonoboy?
I can figure out if I can do that. What is it called? The Sonoboy here. There's Sonoboy there. Oh, and there's on my whole world. Thank you.
Um,
Sonoboy join channel.
yeah. So there is a if you look at the yeah, sorry, if you go a little bit further, sorry, a little bit further down. There's a link to the code. I thought I had in there.
Has two conformance tests from. This is the.
Yeah, oh, I think I've done it in the a little bit further down. Sorry, happy. Yeah, sorry, I did. I found somewhere else. There is a list of tags, and they're publishing it in each patch release of Kubernetes, an updated list, and it is removed in 1.26. But the problem is, as soon as there's nothing to stop the PR getting merged now. Sorry, getting accepted, but it won't come through until Sonoboy update their process.
Is it okay if I ask a question to just make sure I caught everything? So if the project was to merge the conformance PR updates, basically there's no process in place today to ensure that even if a new release was published from Cube, that would be picked up in Sonoboy. And then even if Sonoboy was to pick it up, there's no process in place to have it pick a version that was not from a .0 release of Cube. Is that right?
It looks like there is the ability for it to pick up based off the new patch release of Kubernetes from there's a folder that they've got with all the names of all the various tests that are actually for at that point in time. But then the problem is that the end user would need to be on that patch release of Kubernetes to then be able to submit that version of test results. And if it's a end provider and they can't upgrade their clusters for any particular reason straight away, then they're in a bit of a bind. But I've tried to get some feedback from someone on the Sonoboy team, and there's no sort of feedback I've got so far. So that particular PR can be merged. There's no real blocker from the project, the conformance project. The problem is getting Sonoboy to recognize that update. Because John had asked, Balamarik had asked for some feedback near the end of that particular PR. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess since John is on the call today, it seems like nothing will go wrong by merging it, but it is insufficient to get the end-to-end steps in place. So this plus additional steps will need to occur. And sounds like the poster, the PR, Dan, who unfortunately is not here today, we will, at least I'll make sure to try to get him engaged on the Sonoboy next steps. But
thanks, Derek.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for that detail. It's really helpful.
Cool.
Thanks, Stephen. Next 2 points are from myself. First one is removing influence from
before we move on from this one, I just wanted to clarify. It sounded like you were saying the thing that needed to happen would be backporting the change to conformance and cutting a tag and Sonoboy updating off of that tag
and the person running the tests have a cluster, at least on that version? Like
That's
those
correct.
are the 3 areas that need to happen.
Yes.
Okay, so just from my perspective, if there's a conformance test in that version that we think is problematic, someone who is wanting to certify as conformant would be motivated to update to the patch version that drops that from conformance. So people who aren't affected can continue to sort of oversubmit more tests on older patch versions, and that's fine. They'll still be conformant. And people who are impacted by this test that is actually problematic would be motivated to update. That seems reasonable.
Yeah, the Sonobuoy team may be able to update the historical files, but I'm not too sure whether or not that could historically cause some issues with the conformance bot. But
Yeah, even if
don't
the instructions say like to certify as conformant without this problematic test, you need to run this patch version. That doesn't seem terrible.
Yep.
Thank you, Jordan, for that clarification.
Not
Points
typing
out, sorry
fast
for
enough.
not checking before. All right, removing endpoints from the ineligible list. As most of you would know, that we created a list of ineligible endpoints over the last 3 years, where we stored things that was debated whether it should be eligible or not. We're almost done. There's 3 endpoints left to get to 100% with the things that was open for testing. Now we're busy revisiting the ineligible list, and Jordan already did a very good review for us on that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jordan.
To bring, there's about 40 or 50 endpoints that we're going to bring back. There's a link to the mailing list. There's also a spreadsheet inside the mailing list. If you want to go there and review, we will appreciate as many eyes and comments on that as possible. And I'll be going through that next week. Create an umbrella issue, bring the issues to the front, and then we can, and those marked there in green that Hip is showing is actually 4 that we brought back this week. There is conformance tests for them. So we plan to clean out this list and leave only the things that were really agreed upon to be ineligible in the list. I'm not gonna, unless somebody want to discuss, I'll just jump over to the next thing to be able to get to the last points in the agenda for today. All right, thank you very much for all the input. Then we shared some questions in SIG node. In Slack, there's 3 endpoints that belong to SIG node that is still to be tested. And there is some questions. Stephen can give some more clarity on exactly what we're concerned about. So yeah, whether we should test those or not, and if not, let's step away, and if we have to, let's get them tested as soon as possible. So we'll appreciate some feedback on that.
Patrick made a comment in a particular PR that I've listed in the Slack message, making the comment about how that because port forwarding was a debug feature, it shouldn't be part of conformance. And the thought I was having was that it's more of a debug endpoint that is used for a end user to debug their workloads, not more of a under the hoods like cluster admin. So it's just confirming that those endpoints really should be part of conformance or not. Or if there's any strong opinion of whether or not they shouldn't be part of conformance.
I assume that silence is no immediate opinion. So if people want to look at that so long, I'm happy to swing back to this topic. I just want to give them a chance to bring up your topic. And if there's time left, I'll swing back to discussion of the remaining endpoints.
Yeah, this is Derek. I didn't have time to reflect on this. I had been traveling over the week, and so I missed any message. And if I could take a moment to just study it a little bit closer, I could maybe give a more thorough response. So, but,
Thanks, Derek. Let's do that after them if you're ready. Otherwise, we can async with you.
So it being KEP Freeze week, I've been reading a lot of KEPs, and for giggles, I went through and just started finding other KEPs that sounded interesting that I hadn't read about before. And I noticed 2 points does not a trend make, but it is more than one. I've noticed at least 2 distinct KEPs this week that are related to fixing security issues. That in this case, both of them are relatively niche sort of corner cases that I have a hard time imagine people are doing on purpose or using on purpose, but fixing them would both be breaking changes. And in both cases, I found myself cornered and having to say the correct fix is add an API to opt into security. And I hate it. And I wonder if we as a group should assess our tolerance for breaking changes, especially around security, and doubly especially when it's security and really niche sorts of corner cases that would break. That's all.
That is all.
I can't see hands, so if I'm interrupting, tell me to stop talking. I don't know if these are detectable. Like if the first change we made was like an instrumentation type change to detect use or impact, is that a possibility here?
In one of these cases, it's definitely possible. In the other, I don't think we can know. So the quick summary is one of them is a weird behavior of OCI and runtimes that allows us to read groups information from the container image, even when we shouldn't. And so you can end up running your pod with extra groups assigned. We could detect that and report that this had happened. The other one is host path mounts that are mounted read-only aren't recursively read-only, and any nested mounts underneath it are potentially read-write. And I can't imagine what people are really doing with that on purpose, but if somebody is, it would be a breaking change. And I was also inspired by a Git change recently where Git made a breaking change in their API, their command line APIs, to disable a insecure operation and force you to opt into insecure mode. And as someone who was on the receiving end of that break, I was pretty mad. And so I use that to inform my position that having us not do breaking changes is important. But I wanted to, put it out there and discuss. Do we have a tolerance here? Right now, the tolerance is approximately 0 for breaking.
I guess there's different types of opt-in. There's like platform-wide opt-in. So whoever's running the cluster could choose the better, stricter, whatever behavior. That's one possibility that wouldn't require users to be aware, and could maybe be rolled out gradually. Like new clusters get this on, existing clusters try to do detection. If detection looks good, then turn it on type of patterns.
For at least one of those, we could. We talked about maybe adding admission control that lets the cluster administrator choose to make that breaking change without us doing it by default. It all feels very complicated for something that is really a very niche case. But I don't want to be the person who wakes up on Tuesday and finds that the thing that worked on Monday doesn't work anymore. Anyway, I'm not seeking an answer here, but I wanted to plant this seed, let people think about it. And, you know, if you guys have more concrete suggestions, I'd love to hear them. I imagine that at some point we will come up with something that is actually a real, like, major security issue, and we will face the same decision. And it would be nice to have at least thought about it before then. I yield the floor.
Thanks, Tim. That leaves us with 2 minutes left. Derek, I don't know if you had a moment where you want to comment. Otherwise, we swing around to you.
Yeah, let's
Slack.
let's do this on Slack. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Any other points? Any other last thoughts before we go? Fantastic. Thank you very much for joining the meeting. Have a wonderful weekend.
Can everyone?
Ciao, everyone.